Hello, my name is Doug Tilden. I'm a longtime member of the Steamship Historical Society of America and a former vice president of United States Lines. If you search Wikipedia about U.S. Lines, you'll find the following entry. Quote, one of the founders was Kermit Roosevelt, the son of President Theodore Roosevelt. Unquote. This is a common narrative that Kermit and some of his contemporaries founded U.S. Lines with 3 ships left over from the failure of U.S. Mail's Steamship Company. In my work in archaeology, I've been occasionally amused about how a piece of information, perhaps not fully grounded in fact, can get repeated over and over again and become accepted as fact. In this video, I'll be presenting an alternative and somewhat surprising narrative about the founding of U.S. Lines based on researching contemporary published reports and U.S. government archival material. Roosevelt and several of his business associates were indeed in the room when it happened, but they were there as invited guests of the real founder of U.S. Lines. This video is the first of 2 videos covering the founding of United States Lines. It is subtitled A Tale for Its Time for reasons that I hope I will make obvious. These videos accompany articles published in the spring and upcoming summer editions of Power Ships, the Steamship Historical Society's magazine. These videos provide a more detailed look into the early years of U.S. Lines. U.S. Lines was founded in 1921, making this the 100th anniversary of the company. It is also the 86th anniversary of the Steamship Historical Society. The Society has chosen to honor United States Lines in this important year for the Society. But first, some business. All images used in this presentation are for educational purposes only, and may not be reused without consent. Now on to the presentation. U.S. Lines is probably best known for the operation of the SS United States. The Big U operated from 1952 to 1969 and was the largest passenger ship in the U.S. fleet, as well as the fastest passenger ship in the world, an honor that it still holds. For almost 50 years after World War II, anchored by the Big U and its running mate, the America, U.S. Lines was one of the largest and at times the largest operator in the U.S. flag fleet. When I joined the company in 1969, the company was on the tail end of a 24-ship, decade-long ship construction program. But our focus in this presentation is on the birth and early years of U.S. Lines. This was a very different U.S. Lines than the successful company that existed after World War II. The fact that it made it through its first decade is actually somewhat miraculous. The story of U.S. Lines is a story that would be hard to imagine in more recent history, hence the subtitle that I chose, A Tale for Its Time. Its time was 1920s America, and the 2 things that I think make it representative of that time are: Now, one, it was founded and operated by the United States government for the first 10 years of its existence. And number 2, many high-profile individuals of the age were caught up in the drama of its origins. We will introduce the historical role of many of these individuals in this video and provide a more detailed narrative in the second YouTube video to be released in July. I started with U.S. Lines on Pier 76 North River. It was the last working cargo pier in Manhattan. And if your car was towed in Manhattan in the past 30 years, you'd be very familiar with Pier 76. The first window on the second floor was mine, and for many years the pier still boasted the U.S. Lines name lit up at night. I stayed with U.S. Lines until 1987, when U.S. Lines went bankrupt and was liquidated. At the time of the bankruptcy, one of the persistent and unfortunate beliefs was that U.S. Lines was somehow supported by the U.S. government, and that the government would not let the company go out of business. Like most rumors, this rumor had some basis in outdated fact. U.S. Lines was indeed founded by the U.S. government. This 1926 brochure catalogs the services offered by U.S. government ships, including U.S. Lines, the largest of the U.S. government operators. In fact, the government not only owned the ships, but they also operated them at government's financial risk. In the early 1920s, around 85% of all U.S. flag cargo and passenger vessels were government-owned and operated. The idea of a government-run shipping company in peacetime sounds strange to our modern ears. Today, that would be as if the U.S. government owned and operated all the major U.S.-based airlines. Those kind of things only happen in socialist countries, I thought. Even at the time, government ownership was a concept that was troubling. Longtime U.S. Senator and former Secretary of State, Senator Elihu Root, famously declared that government ownership of the shipping industry would lead to a, quote, a measure of state socialism which will inevitably destroy individual liberty, unquote. Those are pretty strong words. So how did our government become the owner and operator of shipping companies? To answer that question, we need to understand the shipping environment prior to and during World War I, before we move on to the specific events surrounding the founding of United States Lines. The eve of World War I saw a very weak and fragmented U.S. merchant marine. The amount of foreign commerce of the United States that was carried in U.S. ships has vacillated wildly over time. In the 50 years prior to the war, the U.S. merchant marine share of U.S. trade had dropped from over 70% to 9%, a feat only equaled in more recent history. During the heady days of the clipper ships, the majority of U.S. trade was actually carried in U.S. ships. The U.S. led the world in sailing ship design, and the merchant marine was further bolstered by reduced tariff duties on goods shipped on U.S.-flagged vessels. Import duties were reduced as much as 85% if the freight was shipped on a U.S.-flagged vessel. Then came the Civil War. Much of the American fleet was lost to the war. Over 600 merchant ships were acquired by the Union government never to return to commercial service. Ships of both the North and the South were fair game, and most prolific Confederate raiders, led by the CSS Alabama pictured here, burned or took as prizes over 200 Union ships. Additionally, about a third of the pre-war fleet was flagged out to foreign flags to avoid coming to the attention of Confederate raiders or the Union Navy. And while the war was going on, the world of shipping was changing. The rest of the industrialized world was shifting from wooden ships powered by sail to iron and then steel-hulled vessels powered by steam. One of the major developments was the launching of the ship Great Eastern. Built in the UK in 1858, it was the largest and fastest ship of its day. Its length at 700 feet and its gross tonnage was almost twice the average vessel of its day. Like many of the one-off large passenger ships, it did not earn its keep and had a short commercial life, but it helped solidify the change from sail to steam. This transition caught America flat-footed. The U.S. lacked the industrial base to build large fleets of iron and steel vessels. It also lacked the focus on the importance of a merchant marine, unlike the UK, Germany, and France. The British government in particular looked on their shipping industry as the lifeblood of their empire and rewarded the industry with healthy subsidies and low-interest loans. As the U.S. merchant marine shrank in size, the British merchant marine prospered. By the outbreak of World War I, almost half of all world tonnage was British, as shown on this contemporary chart. British ships dominated U.S. trade, and there was even a proposal in Congress in 1902 to allow British ships to carry U.S. coastal trade. Aggravating the decline of U.S. shipping was a decline in support for the reduced import tariff rates that had helped the merchant marine in the first 80 years of the country, and gradually those tariff breaks disappeared. As a result of the shortage of U.S. shipping, the outbreak of war in Europe in 1914 had dire consequences for U.S. foreign trade and the U.S. economy even before the U.S. entered the war in 1917. Unlike today, the U.S. enjoyed a favorable trade balance of exports over imports in the first half of the 20th century. In fact, the U.S. had a favorable balance of merchandise trade every year between 1880 and 1970. The withdrawal of the British ships that dominated our trade to support their own war effort crippled the ability of U.S. exporters to get goods to market. In 1916, Congress and President Wilson responded to the situation with the creation of the United States Shipping Board and its sister organization, which was focused on ship construction, the Emergency Fleet Corporation. This photo of key United States Shipping Board staff was taken in front of the new headquarters with its first chairman, William Denman, front and center. The Shipping Board's initial mission was commercial, to redress the dependence on foreign ships to carry the nation's trade. That mission was preempted 7 months later, in April 1917, by the entry of the U.S. into the war and the need to marshal the nation's scarce maritime resources to support the war effort. The United States Shipping Board, the war years. The United States Shipping Board and the Emergency Fleet Corporation oversaw the largest expansion of shipbuilding capacity the country had ever seen. It was a model that was copied and heavily refined during World War II. The shipbuilding effort included 139 shipyards, many of them new, funded by the government but operated by private companies. This shipbuilding capacity was one of the things that had been missing over the previous 50 years, although it was not without trying to hold on to the wooden ship tradition that made the American fleet great originally. The Emergency Fleet Corporation built over 300 wooden ships during World War I with steam engines. They would turn out to be a significant problem for the USSB. The United States Shipping Board and the Emergency Fleet Corporation did spur the nation to levels of production unknown previously. The Shipping Board also sourced the vessels needed for the war effort in part by seizing ships from belligerents. These ships had mainly sought refuge in the U.S. at war's outbreak in 1914. At that time, the U.S. was neutral, and the ships had been idle in U.S. ports from 1914 until 1917 to keep them away from the British Navy, but they were still under their owners' control. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, the ships were seized by the United States for war use. The seized ships included 91 German ships, which also included 30 passenger liners, one of which was the Vaterland of Hamburg America Line, shown here. The Vaterland, along with her German sisters Imperator and Bismarck, were the largest passenger ships in the world. During World War I, the Vaterland was renamed Leviathan by President Wilson. She was refurbished as a troop transport and served for 2 years, carrying over 120,000 troops to Europe, and then returning troops along with war refugees at the war's end. The Leviathan will be an important part of our story. The United States Shipping Board had not wanted to operate vessels, and in fact, its enabling legislation forbid it from direct operations. But the lack of U.S. shipping expertise forced the Shipping Board to take on the task of operating the wartime merchant marine through executive orders and amendments to its original enabling legislation. This is a theme that will reoccur in our story. The government being pushed into operating U.S. flag vessels despite a strong bias against government operation. During World War I, the government retained ownership of the vessels built for wartime use as well as those commandeered for the war effort, and took on the financial risk of operations. To operate the growing wartime fleet, the Shipping Board settled on a two-tier contract system. Number one, a managing agent, which acted as owner's agent to handle crew, stores, fuel, and repairs, and two, an operating agent to oversee the vessel's loading and discharge ports of call and its at-sea operations. Some companies did both functions. This bureaucratic structure is relevant because the board extended the same format to post-war operations, and as we will see, bent the common definitions of what an agent was to suit their purposes at the time. This is a typical 5,500-ton four-hatch merchant freighter outfitted for war use. At its peak during the war, the Shipping Board operated around 1,350 ships and had agreements with over 160 companies to handle the managing and operating agent agreements, with many companies handling just a few vessels. Historians could be forgiven for concluding that anyone who knew that the pointy end of a ship was called the bow somehow got an agency contract. By comparison, in World War II, the equivalent of the shipping board operated more than 5 times as many vessels, with half the number of shipping companies as World War I. 11 companies, including U.S. lines, had over 100 vessels each, and many of these companies emerged from the war stronger for it. The Shipping Board explained to Congress that the World War I policy of using many small companies was designed to avoid industry dominance by large corporations. It was unsaid but understood that this particularly included J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine. World War I was, after all, not that long after Teddy Roosevelt's trust-busting initiatives. Unfortunately, these policies also kept the merchant marine small and fragmented, and really in no shape to challenge other countries on the world stage. With the end of World War I in 1919, the Shipping Board returned to its original role of trying to rebuild the American merchant marine. The Shipping Board saw itself as a temporary bridge to merchant marine self-sufficiency. The most illustrious of the Shipping Board chairmen was its third, Albert Lasker. He was an advertising executive who knew how to spin a good story. He was the very first post-war chairman. Lasker confidently told Congress in 1921 that the agency would close in 5 years. I believe at the time he thought that was possible. However, he was off by a full decade. The Shipping Board was finally transitioned out of existence in 1936. The government had basically dug its own hole in terms of not being able to get out of the business. Congress, the President, and the Shipping Board did this in a number of ways, but the most significant were, number one, they kept building ships. The Emergency Fleet Corporation had built around 1,400 ships by war's end. It proved politically difficult to simply shut down the over 200 yards producing ships, and around 1,000 ships were launched after the war between 1919 and 1922. 2 of the most famous ship types commissioned in World War I only entered service after the war: the Hog Island freighters, built at the 50-berth yard seen here, and the 535-type combination passenger cargo vessels. The U.S. emerged from the war and the post-war effort with the second largest merchant fleet in the world and significant overcapacity. The second problem was that the Jones Act of 1920 forbid foreign sales of surplus ships. By contrast, after World War II, the government sold over 1,100 surplus war-built ships to foreign owners. These World War II Liberties, Victories, T2 tankers became the backbone of the Greek fleet as well as some Asian fleets. These 2 actions, political in nature, compounded by the wartime policy to keep shipping companies small and fragmented, ensured that the only entity who could keep the ships sailing and American goods and passengers moving to market on U.S. flagged ships was indeed the U.S. government. Back to our important German passenger liners. As we said, of the 91 German ships seized by the U.S. in 1917, 30 of them were passenger liners, most of which were converted to troop transports. This fleet, including the Vaterland, one of the largest passenger ships in the world, and which we have already introduced. It was operated during the war as the Leviathan, and the name stuck. Steamship Historical Society member Richard Rabbett has done comprehensive and fascinating research on the Leviathan, which can be accessed on YouTube. I will leave the reference below. Immediately after the war, there was heated discussion within the Shipping Board and within Congress about what to do with the German ships. The Shipping Board tried to sell all 30 passenger liners with the stipulation that the buyer must be an American company. They got no responsive bids. The failed sale led the Shipping Board to spend around $75 million to refurbish the passenger vessels for peacetime use and tried to find operators who would be willing to charter them. The Shipping Board had testified to Congress in February 1920, specifically in regard to the German liners, that, quote, there are no firms in the United States who have had the experience to organize and handle this kind of tonnage, unquote. In 1920, the Shipping Board found the United States Mail Steamship Company. U.S. Mail was formed that year by the Mayer family of Baltimore for the specific purpose of operating the German liners, and is not to be confused with the 1848 company of the same name. The Mayers had operated 2 Shipping Board-owned steel cargo vessels and 8 of the Shipping Board's ill-fated wooden cargo ships during the war. At war's end, one of the Mayer companies owed the Shipping Board over $1 million and had to file for bankruptcy on December 6, 1920. Despite the issues with the Mayer companies, the Shipping Board was hungry to get the vessels off their hands, and U.S. Mail secured a 5-year charter on 12 Shipping Board vessels, including 10 of the German liners. The German ships did not include the Leviathan, which at this point was under contract with the International Mercantile Marine and awaiting refurbishment, with William Francis Gibbs and his brother Frederick slated to oversee conversion, working for and paid for the IMM. The 2 largest ships in the U.S. Mail fleet were the America pictured here, formerly the America with a K of Hapag, and the George Washington, formerly of the same name of North German Lloyd. Both ships had extensive followings of passengers from their pre-war days. It would become the flagships of the fleet for its first 2 years. The fact that the Shipping Board went ahead with the deal with U.S. Mail Steamship, despite clear warnings, is another theme that will repeat itself in the early years of United States lines. Charter hire payments from U.S. Mail quickly became delinquent. The Shipping Board realized that the deal with the Mayers was in trouble. The Shipping Board started contacting other quote-unquote shipping men to gauge interest in a replacement for U.S. Mail. One of the first people they spoke with was Kermit Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt and the principal of Roosevelt Steamship Company. For the next 18 years, Kermit would play a role in United States Line's development, and he will be one of the principal players in our second YouTube video. The Shipping Board attempted to get Kermit to charter the vessels through his company, Roosevelt Steamship. Kermit, in turn, brought in Kerr Line, the predecessor of modern-day Kerr Steamship. The Shipping Board also approached W. Averill Harriman, at that time the chairman of United American Line. This was the same Averill Harriman who served as Secretary of State under Kennedy and was one of the architects of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Harriman had extensive holdings in both railroads and shipping. Roosevelt and Harriman and their consortia faced off over the fleet and acrimony, but in the end, the Shipping Board's efforts to charter or sell the ships to them or anyone else were unsuccessful. The companies were simply not willing to pay the kind of charter hire rates that would cover costs. At the same time, the situation with the Mayers was becoming complicated. Auditors hired by the Shipping Board found that the Mayers had been inappropriately using deposits for voyage expenses given by European immigrants. The Shipping Board demanded that the Mayers pay the charter hire that was outstanding and return over $1 million in misappropriated funds or return the ships. The Mayers responded with a public relations and legal campaign to retain the vessels. The Shipping Board decided at this juncture to use their wartime powers to operate the ships, at least in the short term, while they further searched for a company who would charter them. Albert Lasker, the Shipping Board chair, turned again to Roosevelt and Harriman, along with Emmett McCormick of Moore McCormick Lines, and requested them to establish a supervisory board to so oversee the new company, to be named by him United States Lines. The principals were to provide their services to the line without compensation as a patriotic duty. The Shipping Board sued in U.S. District Court to recover the vessels from the Mayers. In a period piece of high drama, Roosevelt, Harriman, McCormick, and McCormick's partner Albert Moore attended the August 27, 1921 hearing in New York court where Judge Martin Manton ordered the return of the ships to the Shipping Board. The 4 of them then walked to the 45 Broadway offices of the Shipping Board and met with Albert Lasker and executed the supervisory agreement. From Lasker's window, they could see the U.S. Mail flagship, the America, headed for sea. United States Lines was born. The roles of the 3 shipping men have been clouded with time. The 3 of them were in the room when it happened, and both contemporary accounts and history gives the 3, particularly Roosevelt, credit for forming United States Lines. However, the record does not substantiate that claim. It appears more likely that Lasker wanted to use the good names of the three to bestow legitimacy on the continuing operation of the government of these passenger liners. Lasker was also testifying in Congress at about this very same time against continued operation of shipping by the government. His two predecessors had similarly testified in Congress in opposition to government operation of ships. Lasker was clearly conflicted. As I mentioned, Roosevelt, Harriman, and McCormick served as the supervisory board for United States Lines without compensation. However, their companies acted as ticket agents for the line. Advertising for the line by the shipping board, on the other hand, showed the three companies as managing agents. This appears to have been a loose interpretation of the term, as the public knew it from the wartime operations of the shipping board. Both Roosevelt and McCormick testified in court in 1923 that they and their companies played no role in the management of the ships. The operation of United States Lines was entirely a government enterprise. As I said, I believe the depiction of Roosevelt, Harriman, and Moore as the founders of U.S. Lines was a convenient bit of advertising spin from the master, Albert Lasker. It is of interest that at the time of the transition from U.S. Mail to United States Lines in 1921, 2 years after the war ended, the shipping board was still operating 1,700 ships acquired during the war through contracts with 54 operating companies. They also took delivery of 384 new vessels during that year and supervised the wind down of over 100 wartime shipyards. In this complex environment, the demise of U.S. Mail and the rise of United States Lines did not even warrant a footnote in the Shipping Board's annual report to Congress for 1921. As we've mentioned before, the intention of the Shipping Board was that their direct operation of U.S. Lines would only be for the short term, until they found a replacement company to operate the line. The whole enterprise was supposed to go out of business by 1924. As we have seen, though, the government had raised some high barriers to exit with overbuilding and restricting foreign sales. These barriers would become even higher as the 1920s wore on. Initially, 10 of the 11 U.S. mail ships were transferred to United States Lines. The America and the George Washington retained their names, and 6 of the other vessels were given president prefixes. These ships were augmented by 2 of the 535-type new-build passenger liners, the President Roosevelt and the President Harding. These ships were not opulent luxury liners, but were very comfortable workhorses of the U.S. passenger trade. The Roosevelt, named for Teddy, not Kermit, is dramatically pictured here. The involvement of the 3 shipping men and their companies in the operation of United States Lines would not survive long. Less than a year after the formation of United States Lines, Harriman resigned when his United American Line went in competition with United States Lines. 9 months later, on January 4, 1923, both Roosevelt and Moore's role with the line was terminated by Lasker. However, this was not the end of Roosevelt's role with the United States Lines. He would reappear in our saga many times in the next decade. In my opinion, the event that distinguished United States Lines during this period was the assignment of Leviathan, seen here, to the company in 1923. The original intention of the shipping board had been to sell the Leviathan to J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine, who would be financially responsible for its refurbishment. Morgan had died in 1913, shortly after the sinking of the Titanic, and the IMM was now ably steered by its chairman, P.A.S. Franklin. Franklin, seen here, and his son John, would play a major role with the United States Lines all the way through 1967. When I joined the company in 1969, their names were spoken with reverence in the hallowed halls of United States Lines headquarters at No. 1 Broadway, New York, which, incidentally, had also been the IMM's headquarters. There was considerable public pushback to the idea of IMM operating Leviathan, with William Randolph Hearst leading the opposition and suing to block the sale. Although IMM was fully owned and controlled in the United States, Hearst objected to the IMM's British investments and influence. IMM did not help the situation when they announced that they were introducing the sister ship of the Leviathan, the Bismarck, as the Majestic of London-based White Star Line. The Bismarck had been completed in Germany after the war and turned over to Britain as war reparations. After terminating the agreement with IMM for the Leviathan, there were several failed attempts to find an operator for the ship, including a proposal from the Gibbs brothers, William, Francis, and Frederick, the naval architects in charge of its refurbishment. These same pair were the eventual designers of the SS United States. In January 1923, the shipping board finally decided that their own company, United States Lines, would be the operator, and the shipping board took over the responsibility for an $8.2 million refurbishment. The Leviathan became the flagship of the United States Lines fleet. The 1920s turned out to be a trying time for U.S. flagged passenger vessels and the United States Shipping Board. First off was the Volstead Act prohibiting the sale of liquor, which went into effect on January 17, 1920. Initially, it was not clear how this would apply to passenger ships on the high seas, and it took almost a year for the issue to be clarified. In the end, U.S. flagged vessels were prohibited from having liquor on board at all, and foreign ships were not prohibited outside of U.S. territorial waters. This placed U.S. ships at yet another disadvantage. Who wants to cruise the Atlantic without booze? In 1920, there was also a general collapse in freight rates resulting from too many war surplus vessels chasing too little cargo. Most of the U.S. Lines passenger liners had considerable cargo space, and this hurt. Arguably the biggest impact, however, was decline in immigration to the United States. Immigration was the backbone of the transatlantic passenger trade, and in 1922 there were 80 passenger vessels trading between Europe and the U.S. Immigrants were their bread and butter. In 1924, the U.S. Congress passed legislation drastically reducing immigration quotas, with the result that total immigration dropped from 423,000 in 1923 to an average of 164,000 a year for the rest of the decade, a 61.3% decline. Throughout the 1920s, in both passenger and freight operations, the shipping board incurred significant losses. As much as $41 million in a single year had to be made up for by annual appropriations from Congress. Ironically, during the same period, efforts to establish direct and indirect subsidies to private owners died in Congress again and again, virtually assuring continued government operation of United States Lines, the other passenger ships, and the U.S. flag cargo fleet. The U.S. Lines fleet would be reorganized several times during this era. By 1926, it was down to 6 ships, with Leviathan as flagship. She was augmented by the original George Washington in America, as well as one more ex-German liner, the Republic, formerly the President Grant of Hapag, seen here, and 2 of the 535 combination liners. The shipping board did attempt to rid itself of United States Lines several times during this period. These efforts included several more attempts by the Gibbs brothers to gain control of the Leviathan by gaining control of United States Lines. We will cover the Gibbses in more detail in the second article on YouTube. It is likely most fortunate for Gibbs and Cox, today one of the premier U.S. naval architects, that their efforts to buy U.S. Lines in the 1920s failed. The shipping board's operation of United States Lines would continue until 1929. In that year, the shipping board solicited bids for United States Lines and another passenger line, American Merchant Lines. The bidders for United States Lines once again included the Gibbs brothers. The shipping board sold the companies to New York banker Paul W. Chapman. It was the 1920 Meyer saga all over again, just a decade later. Chapman was undercapitalized and was unlucky enough to have closed on the deal just before the 1929 stock market crash and ensuing depression. Chapman did initiate two new buildings, the 1,300 passenger capacity Manhattan, seen here, and the Washington, which became the core of the 1930s U.S. Lines passenger fleet. After Chapman defaulted on loan obligations, the shipping board once again had to take control of United States Lines, which they did in 1931. United States Lines was then reorganized by the shipping board as a Nevada corporation. The International Mercantile Marine, which by this time had divested its problematic European holdings and merged with Kermit's Roosevelt Steamship Company, gained full control over United States Lines in the following years through a complex series of stock transfers. Kermit Roosevelt and P.A.S. Franklin of the IMM joined the board of the new United States Lines. The Manhattan and the Washington were finished during the IMM era. Kermit Roosevelt's mother christened the Manhattan, and Kermit gave remarks at the ceremony. P.A.S. Franklin achieved his aspiration at last to operate the Leviathan, although ironically he almost immediately began petitioning the shipping board for them to take the ship back. The IMM brought a prolonged period of stability to United States Lines and opened the way for investment in new vessels as well as expansion into cargo services. The remaining U.S. flag companies owned by IMM were merged into United States Lines, including the American Line, which was founded in 1871. The American Line brought the most iconic of symbols to the line, the Blue Eagle house flag. This was the house flag that flew over all United States Lines vessels, including its most cherished vessel, the SS United States. Thank you very much.